Got it. Okay, that wasn't nerve-wracking at all. Okay. Fear is, riddle of our existence. Am I right? Thank you, Stephen. I really appreciate you asking me to do this. My name is Max, and I'm an alcoholic. And my sobriety date is June 16th, 1981. I live in Mount Pleasant, South Carolina. I have a sponsor. He has a sponsor. And I'm a member of the home group, Holy City Speaker Group. And I just told you the three most important things about myself. I told you what I am, who I am, and where I belong. And I am a member of Alcoholics Anonymous in good standing, I'd like to think. And I'm going to say a whole lot of positive things tonight about Alcoholics Anonymous because I love Alcoholics Anonymous. And I'm not going to. Hello, somebody jumping in. One of my things I don't like is when I hear people talk about the things they don't like about Alcoholics Anonymous. And trust me, if you stay around Alcoholics Anonymous long enough, there will be things you don't like about Alcoholics Anonymous. But the way I came in here, I need to stay with the positive things, and there's so many. And this right here, right now, being with this meeting with all these people from all over the country is like the most awesome thing in the world to me. I know so many people around the country, and when Zoom happened, I love what you read at the beginning, Stephen, that's in the 4th edition, because prior to the pandemic, if you had asked me what I thought about online meetings, I probably would have told you that's not even a meeting. That's not a meeting. What are you doing? And, because that's where my mind immediately goes. And then the pandemic happens. Now I'm from New York, and I'm mostly going to talk about AA in New York. I got sober in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And after my first year, I moved back to New York. And that's where I spent 34 years before I moved to Charleston, South Carolina. And I love the AA where I came from, and I love the AA in Charleston. So really, and I love the AA in Charleston because the AA in New York taught me that there's really great AA everywhere. And I got a ton of friends in California because I had a sponsor out there for a long time. And so when the pandemic happened and Zoom happened, it was just awesome. I was going to meetings in Baton Rouge. I was going to meetings in LA. I was going to meetings in New York at my home group. And it was beautiful, and I'm so grateful that it's still going on. Is really what I wanted to say, to start. So, and I when you get sober at the age I got sober at, you got to learn to fill a little bit. You know what I mean? You learn to do that. When I was 12 years sober, I was doing a job down in Texas, and they asked me to speak. And it's a true story. And I said, sure, no problem. How long do you want me to speak? They're like 50 minutes. I was like, cool, 15 minutes, no problem. Because at that time I was living in New York City, and in the typical New York City meeting, you share for 20 minutes. That's a typical, not the Atlantic group, but a typical, meeting in New York City, you speak for 20 minutes. So I'm like, cool, 15 minutes. And they're like, no, 50 minutes. I'm like, I got sober when I was 15. They're like, well, just tell the whole story. I was like, what? Okay. And I knew how to talk for 30 minutes, 35 minutes. But anyway, there's a clock on the back of the wall. And my whole point about this is I really want to talk a lot about recovery tonight. But I also want to tell you my story, and it's really important. But there was a clock in the back of the room, and it was like 8:05 when I started. And I'm like, start telling my story. And I'm like, I'm not going to make it. It's like 8:10 and I'm in the first grade, and I'm like going. And what happens when you start telling your story in Alcoholics Anonymous, they can go on for days. The next thing I know, it's 8:40. I'm in 7th grade, because they're like, tell the whole story. Yeah, I could tell the guys were getting a little restless. Then I learned, I'm like, okay, I got to tighten this thing up. I got to start doing some fill. I got to do, but what's happened over the years, it's really weird because where I come from, you go out speaking a lot, but you get asked to speak. It's not like Westchester, New York, which is outside of New York City, which is where I'm from. The AA is awesome. It's where Bill Wilson lived. And a lot of discussion meetings, and every group has a speaker meeting. And every week, groups go to different groups, and in New York City too, actually. And because groups from Westchester will go into New York City, and they have a speaker meeting, and they, and go down and speak, but you don't know what you're getting. You know, it's very different than a speaker meeting. When you invite a speaker, you know, the Atlantic group and all the speaker meetings like in California, you know. So anyway, but I started doing a lot of speaking then, and you know, I love to speak, and I don't love to speak because I like to hear my voice. And before I came into Alcoholics Anonymous, that would have been the story 100%. It is because I wanted to hear my voice, and I had an ego that was bigger than this meeting. Let me tell you that for sure. And I had it, and which is really funny because my self-esteem was really, really low, but I had a really big ego. You know what I mean? You know, they talk about egomaniac with an inferiority complex. I mean, that was me, you know? So I know some people on this meeting, and I'm really happy to see some friends on here. I don't have a big computer, so I can't see all 171 of you, but you know, I want to tell you my story because, like I said, most of you don't know me. I was born in Washington, D.C., and I believe I had alcoholism before I picked up a drink, but I don't believe I became an alcoholic until I started drinking, if that makes sense to anybody. Okay. But you know, and I don't know if it's, you know, the reason I'm an alcoholic or the reason I had the disease I had before I started drinking was because I moved 7 times before I was 7 years old. You know, born in Washington, D.C., moved to New York when I was 1 year old, lived in Brooklyn in 2 places, moved to Westchester, lived in 3 places. Parents got divorced when I was 7. And I come from 2 highly intellectual parents, highly political parents. Being born in DC, they were both in DC doing political stuff. My mom was a political science major, which I just learned about 10 years ago, which explains a lot of our problems. And I was like, because I got to the point where I was like, we can't talk about politics. I don't even talk about politics. But I never understood why she always talked about politics. And then I found out she was a poli-sci major in college. And but I will say this, that my parents did divorce as well as anybody could. And I tell you that because there's no, you know, there was no tragedy in my life before I got sober that was like the propelling thing into me drinking. But I will tell you that what I wrote on my original 4-step, which was 30 pages of defects of character, of fear, and lust, and dishonesty, and resentments, and all the stuff that I wrote about, you know, I had before I picked up a drink. I mean, I was, you know, my sponsor used to say it all the time that he needed to be treated special to feel normal. And when he was treated normally, he felt less than. And I highly relate to that. You know, I got a ton of attention up until about the age 7, like a ton of attention, you know, from not just your girls, which was great, but everybody. And then that stopped. And when that stopped, I didn't know what to do. When my parents split, we moved to another part of northern Westchester, and we moved into another school. I didn't know what to do, you know, and when, you know, my friend Israel says he needed a drink at 6 years old, 100%. I needed a drink at that age. I was chewing tobacco. You know, I did other things before I started drinking. You know, I was a stealer. You know, I stole a lot. You know, if you ever listen to Norm Alpe, he talks about that. You know, I had to fill up that alcoholism prior to picking up a drink. And another thing I highly relate with Norm Alpe is when I picked up a drink at age 10, finally, and I enjoyed it a lot, but it was not like, oh my God, this is it. Oh my God, like I found the answer to life. And I don't even believe I was an alcoholic when I picked up that first drink. And that's okay if you do. And there's going to be things I say that you might not agree with, and that's okay too. Just don't tell me afterwards, please. I'm very sensitive, as we have found out. But you know, but it gave me the okay. This is good. Then I started drinking more when I was 11, and I liked it a lot more when I started drinking more at 11. You know, I drank a bunch of wine one night at my friend's house, and I did some other stuff. You know, and alcohol is in the beginning of my story, and alcohol is at the end, and there's a whole bunch of things in between. Not a whole bunch of things, but one thing in particular that made me eat a lot of donuts and, you know, stuff like that. But I did you know, anything I could to get out of self, snorting rush and all kinds of stupid things. But the drinking really kicked off for me when I was about 12 years old. Man, I'll tell you, I know when I tell my story, it's probably hard not to get fixated on the age I was when I came in to Alcoholics Anonymous. And I get that. You know, my friend Laura's is on this meeting and I heard her say it. And I thought that was beautiful, that her it's different than other people's it, right? Because I know people who came into this program at, since I moved down to Charleston, there's a guy who came in like 51 years old. I mean, he didn't pick up a drink till he was like 51. And within 2 years, he hit a bottom. I know a guy up in New York who, came in at 48. And by the time he was 50, he hit a bottom. And I don't think it matters at all when we start drinking or what happens. I think what really matters is by the time I was 12 years old, when I started drinking, I couldn't stop. And we talk about the allergy in the meetings. The doctor's opinion talks about the allergy, that our body reacts differently than other people. And I love what he says, that, he's not satisfied just because we're maladjusted to life. That makes us alcoholic. I was really maladjusted to life. That was 100% true. I tried to stab a kid when I was 6 years old because I saw West Side Story, and that's what Riff did. So I went to school with a knife and tried to stab this kid. Now, if that happened today, who knows? But nothing happened. I mean, I was like not allowed to see him for the summer. That's just how it was. My older brother, I'm not sure if he's on here or not. I invited him. He precedes me in alcoholism. And partly why I didn't get into the trouble I got into is my brother was a lot worse than I was. And my brother got kicked out of this elementary school, which is about a mile from where Bill Wilson lived in Katona, New York. And, it was just a different time, right? So I just tell you all this to let you know that when that's who picked up a drink. So the drinking started really bad when I was 12. I had my first blackout when I was 12. And I had a lot of access to alcohol. My mom, we had an alcoholic living with us. So I had a closet full of alcohol, and I did what most teenagers do is I poured out a lot of alcohol into mason jars, and then I would pour water into the whiskey bottles. Then the whiskey bottle started looking watery, and the alcoholic that my mom was living with didn't like that very much. And I heard a woman years ago say something like genius. She poured iced tea in there to make the color better, right? I was like, wow, why didn't I think of that, right? But I mean, things were so bad when I was 12 years old. Now, let's understand something. My birthday's in September. So when I talk about my drinking really kicking off when I was 12, I was about to go into the 8th grade. And that was the year that it really got bad. It got so bad that my swim coach, and I was like an all-county swimmer. It was the one thing I really excelled at. It's the one place I got real self-esteem. I was also like the fastest kid in my school. So through sports, I got a lot of self-esteem. That was it, right? My swim coach sat me down. She told me that she thought I had a drinking problem. And I thought she was overreacting a little bit, I mean, I didn't even know how to react to it. Like, what are you talking about? Because she saw me coming out of the woods drunk, at 12 years old. But, frothy emotional appeal seldom suffices, And by the time things got really bad and my mom starts crying and asking me not to drink, that doesn't get me to stop drinking. When the principal's yelling at me because I've gotten into trouble again as a direct result of drinking, that doesn't get me to even want to stop drinking. It makes me want to drink more. When I black out, because I stay after school one day and I drink, and I don't realize that if you don't eat until 3:00 in the afternoon, you start drinking, that you black out very quickly, which I found out that day. And then you're thumbing a ride home. And you walk in the house and say, Mom, I'm drunk. You can grab me if you want, but I got to go to sleep. And then you're dry heaving all morning. But you go to school because you told kids you got some stuff that you're going to get them at, in the AM. That's where I was, right? And a really bad thing happened in my 9th grade year. We had a party one night. My mom met a man who lived in New Orleans. So my mother started taking trips to New Orleans. So what my brother and I thought was a good idea, we should have keg parties. So we had a keg party I don't know why we had a keg party on Thursday night, but we did. And I woke up on Friday morning. Everybody else wasn't going to school, but I took a knife to school, and that was a really bad idea. And a really bad thing happened at school with another person and another guy, and my name ended up in the paper, stabbing at John Jay. And I didn't even do the wielding of the knife, but things were just going like bad to worse. And the only reason I tell that story when I tell my story is that when the cops were yelling at me, all I could think about was the keg party we were having that night, right? That's all I'm thinking about, because that's where I was in my alcoholism. And but more importantly, that was a year, more than a year before I got sober. And that's why I tell that story, because that's where I was when I was 14 years old. I was like drinking, completely obsessed my mind. And when I started drinking, I couldn't stop ever. I started losing friends. I had really good friends. I had my best friend's father was an alcoholic, and I'm going to share a couple more stories, then I'm going to get to my sobriety. So, we talk about it. My sponsor used to say it all the time, that if alcohol is your problem, you're not an alcoholic. And if, you're an alcoholic, alcohol is not your problem. Well, what does that mean? Well, what it means to me is this best friend I'm talking about, the summer between my ninth grade year, because I went to boarding school, which was my biggest resentment, that I stayed back, and I went to boarding school. I had to repeat ninth grade. That was my biggest resentment when I came into Alcoholics Anonymous. It's a miracle I made it to the ninth grade. I should not have made it to the eighth grade or sixth grade. I should have been just kept in first grade, to tell you the truth. But it's a miracle, when I thought back on it, when I got honest with myself. But we went down to New Orleans, and if anybody doesn't know, people drink in New Orleans a lot. And I drank in New Orleans. I had been at Mardi Gras. I got really drunk at Mardi Gras. I was drinking. I can't wait to go to New Orleans for a month with my best friend, who's got a ton of cash, because he worked. I didn't work. I just stole money from my mother. Every day I would take money out of her purse and go to school and then buy a six-pack. You could buy a six-pack back then for $2, right? So my best friend, whose father's an alcoholic, at this point is very concerned about me. So the first night we get to New Orleans, I get 2 quarts of alcohol, and I drink them. We all got a quart of alcohol. He didn't want his, so I drank his quart. And he didn't believe me, and he found out that I did drink it. Well, I didn't get to drink for the next month. It was a hell. That's alcoholism. It's like, that's where once I got sober and I did the steps and I heard people speak, that's what, to me, shows my alcoholism more than blacking out, peeing on the tire in front of my mom's friends, fights I got into, waking up out of blackouts with people wanting to beat me up. When I wasn't drinking for about 3.5 weeks and I couldn't drink, and I was kicking my dog and I was yelling at my mother, I couldn't even talk to my best friend. That's alcoholism, and I got to make amends to him, and I got to make amends to a couple other people in his family. And, I got to sit in a meeting with his father years later, who I had known as the, alcoholic. And another time we went to France for 2 weeks when I was 14. I went with my grandmother and my mother. And my mother is not an alcoholic. Couldn't be an alcoholic if she tried. She's like my wife. My wife says really, really weird things around drinking. We were out not that long ago, and she's like, I don't like the taste. I'm going to return it. I'm like, first of all, you can't return it. Uh-oh. Okay. Did I do anything wrong, Steven? No. Recording's back in progress, I think, right? Good. All right. So I'll just keep talking. Hopefully you guys can hear me. I'm like, Claudia's got my eye right here. My dad was from Maryland, by the way. So those 2 weeks in Paris, I'm not drinking. My mom, again, not an alcoholic. She's like, Max, do you want a little wine? Because she was very sophisticated. She would talk about having wine with steak or whatever, and things got so bad. We were in Cannes, south of France. I ran back to the hotel and I chugged almost, a half gallon of wine, because I couldn't handle being sober. That's alcoholism. When I tell my story, I should probably just tell those 2 stories, because I got to tell you, I'm 41 years sober now. I'm 57 years old. And I got to tell you, it's even weird to me. You know what I mean? I mean, I think about when I talk about the years, I mean, I love my experience in Alcoholics Anonymous, which I'm about to talk about, but it has gone so fast. But I've been blessed with never, ever, not one time, living in the delusion that I'm not an alcoholic, that I didn't drink too much, that I was too young. because the way I drank like I was going to the electric chair. You know what I mean? I drank like an animal. And if I knew I was going into treatment on June 16th, 1981, trust me, I would have made a huge scene down in New Orleans. But my mother, what happened was I got kicked out of boarding school. I mean, I got into all kinds of trouble at boarding school. I should have been kicked out. And that my bottom is walking around Boston train station before I'm coming home, asking people who look like my parents to buy my watch, and to buy a lighter so I can drink. 'Cause I'm not getting on that Amtrak for a 4-hour train ride, not drinking. And I got, I think I sold my watch or lighter, and I got my drinks. And a woman bought me some drinks on the train, and and it was the first time my father later told me he was concerned. When I got off the train, I was drunk. And he had seen me drunk before, but my father worked in New York City, and my stepmother. So my father and my stepmother never really saw me at my cups, as we could say. He'd have crab feasts every year. Claudia, you know about a crab feast, maybe? That he'd see me drunk at those, but that's what a 14-year-old kid does, and he doesn't see that I'm driving with my buddy Fritz on our bicycles, and I'm drunk, and my buddy Fritz is on LSD, and I feel superior to Fritz because I'm only drunk and he's on acid, right? Like, man, Fritz got a problem. You know what I mean? I always felt you always got to get those friends who are just a little worse off, And I had this one friend, we didn't know where he went, but he was going to rehab. But all we knew is Brendan was going away, and we know Brendan was a lot worse than us, right? And well, then I get taken away. So I'm on the porch, I'm smoking a joint, I'm drinking a vodka and orange juice, and I get a call from my mom, and she's like, "You have to come to New Orleans." And we get down outside of New Orleans, and she says, "Look, on Tuesday you're going into a treatment center for drugs and alcohol." So I've been doing a lot of research, and you seem to have all the symptoms. Now, she had bought me some beer. She had been, this is 1981. You got to remember, it was a different time coming out of the 70s. It was different. I'm drinking in New Orleans. It was just a very different time. And I was like, "Well, tell me one of the symptoms I got." Well, she's like, "Well, you drink really fast." And I had already finished the beer. I was like, "Well, can't deny. What do I say?" Right. I was a really good liar, but I was kind of red-handed right there. But, the anger didn't hit me till the hour and a half drive to Baton Rouge. And I was angry. And I wasn't I was angry at my mother, but I knew she loved me. And I knew she didn't want me to die, right? And I knew she didn't want me to go on the way I was going on. But what I was mostly angry with is that maybe alcohol is going to be taken away from me and the way I was living. Because I love that. I wanted to keep going the way I was going, and I didn't care what happened, you know? But I got put into that treatment center, and I was telling somebody about this last night that I figured I'm just going to lie my way through. I was a really good liar. I was such a good liar. I got drunk on the train with a woman up to Boston one time. I lied to her all the way up. And when we were about 20 minutes outside of Boston, I said, "Look, everything I've told you, everything is a complete lie." She thought that was so cool. When she got back to college, she was going to write a paper about it, because I told her some pretty extensive lies. So, which is why when I'm in the treatment center, and if you read page 200 of Dr. Bob and the Good Old Timers, it talks about how the treatment centers back then were taking the formula that they used from Dr. Bob when he got sober, and you had to work the first 5 steps before you left the treatment center. Well, I wasn't going to make it through that treatment center because there's this thing called the 4-step, and there was honesty in that 4-step, and I was not about to do that, but I did it. I mean, I got my first step during the family week. I understood that alcohol came in front of everything in my life, and I conceded to my innermost self that I was powerless over alcohol, and I got it, and I got the we, and I think the we is the most important word in the first step. Take everything else, but we, you and me, stay sober. Me, I drink every time, but I'm here with you guys because I don't want to drink. I ended up having a very intense spiritual experience on my 52nd day. And I got on my knees and I asked God. I just said, "Help." I didn't know. Now, it's funny. I don't normally talk about this, but I want to mention this real quick. My mother was an atheist. My dad was a really spiritual guy. My dad was raised religious and spiritual in Baltimore, Maryland, with his family. He was also the first to leave his family and go to college and get an education and all that. But my dad and I would talk about God, when I was drinking and getting high, and we'd be walking along and we'd be talking about God and stuff like that. But you know, when I got sober and I went through the steps and I understood the steps, and I started reading the 12 and 12, and it talks about people have, that have had a God and lost it. Sometimes it's harder than somebody who doesn't have any God. And I mean, like, I'm grateful in hindsight that I didn't have any religion, because when I moved up to the Mamaroneck group in New York, everyone was a BIC, a Bronx Irish Catholic. They weren't happy about it, and I was like, and I didn't relate to that. I didn't relate to, having an issue. Sandy Beach used to talk about it. He was going to hell by the time he was 13. A lot of people have that story. I don't have that story. I have the story of my father telling me when my parents got divorced that God's the most important thing in my life. It's the only permanent relationship I'm ever going to have. So, and he's always with me. And through my drinking, when things were getting really bad, or I would come out of something that was like where things really should have gotten bad and I came out of it, I always remember what my father said. My father gave me a Bible when I went into treatment. And I'm not putting down religion by any means about what I'm about to say. But I had the experience of Alcoholics Anonymous way before I had the understanding of Alcoholics Anonymous. Okay. I came to believe because I saw people sober. I saw a guy who was, 52 days sober when I was 6 days sober. And I believed that he was sober. And I believed that I could do it too. And that was all I needed. My counselor in treatment, when I was on the third step, he said, "Tell me about the third step." I said, "Well, it's all about turning your life and will over to God. It's all about God and turn." He's like, it's about making a decision. I was like, oh, I mean, I wasn't that smart to begin with, which is a really good thing when you come into Alcoholics Anonymous. But that was the night I had my spiritual experience. I was walking down the hall of this treatment center, which had about 40 kids in it. And it was like there was nobody in the place. It was kind of a like weird Bill Wilson experience. It wasn't wind blowing. It wasn't a light. I mean, it got like dark. And I literally felt the presence that was bigger than the treatment center, bigger than my family, that wanted me sober. And the truth of the matter is, it's the same power that's keeping me sober today, the way I believe it. It's a God of our understanding. And I believe that there's a God that's bigger than the sum of all the people in any meeting, anywhere. And that's what keeps me sober. And I'm not going to draw a picture of my God, but it's all about God for me, and I love that our big book tells us don't be shy about talking about God right up front, like you're going to scare people away from Alcoholics Anonymous. Trust me, my defiance is what was going to get me out of Alcoholics Anonymous. I had to wear a sign in treatment that said, "You are defiant." You know what I mean? And I was like, that would have got me drunk. And the book's very clear that only belligerent that belligerence is going to keep us drunk. Telling us that you can have a God of your understanding, which is what we say. It does not say we have to believe in any God. They told me I could believe in a radiator, a doorknob, which I thought was silly, but I am so grateful that they said that. Because they said that, I just started calling it God from the get-go. And I got on my knees and it helped me write an honest 4-step. Okay. And I wrote it like honest 4-step I was talking about earlier, 30 pages of dishonesty, pride, gluttony, everything. I got it all. And I sat down with Father Lyle and I sat with him for 5 hours doing a 5th step. Okay. And those promises that they talk about on page 75, that happens after the 5th step. I hear a lot of people say that didn't happen to them. And I say, keep doing the steps until that happens. Because it was the most intense experience I've ever had. Walking down that hall and like those feelings, I felt close to God. I just purged for 5 hours. And what does the book tell us? To go back to our room, pull the bookshelf. So I did that. I fell asleep. And I didn't really go ahead with 6 and 7. I was supposed to be going ahead with 6 and 7. But as I've seen with pretty much everybody I've ever sponsored, and I am so grateful that my sponsor got me sponsored when I was 17 years old. And I've been sponsoring ever since. I'd like to think I sponsor better today than I did when I was 17 years old. I was 17 years old. I was sponsoring a guy who was 35. He's like, "I'm having a hard time at work." I was like, "Quit." He's like, "I'm having a hard time with my wife." I was like, "Leave her, get to your meeting." The book says wife or no wife, So And that's just a true story, actually. And the guy Bill's still sober, just so you know. But my sponsor's like, Max, your job is to take somebody through the 12 steps. But I want to tell you as much as I can about my 41 years, because it's been pretty awesome. The experience, the internal experience, the external experience isn't that great. I was on a meeting the other night. Guy was on the meeting. Guy's got 150 awards from his company. He had a really pretty cool story. I've got no awards since I've been sober, which is fine. It's a really good thing for a guy with an ego like mine. I work at Home Depot and I'm proud of it. I love it. And that's just where I'm at 41 years, and it's a beautiful thing. So, that probably doesn't make much sense, but I was going to be an actor. You were going to know me, okay? Because I got sober with an actor, my sponsor's brother. I got sober with Ray O'Keefe in the world famous Mamaroneck group. We had a sign that said the world famous Mamaroneck group, and it was exciting, okay? It was an exciting, awesome time. Like, the first thing Ray said to me when I met him, he's like, how old were you? I was 16 when I met him. I was over a year sober, which really kind of threw all the old timers off in the group. When I joined the group and I was 16, I had over a year, because you didn't share if you didn't have a year at the step meetings. And hey, Ray, nice to meet you. He's like, how old are you, kid? And I was like 16. He's like, I know a girl in California got sober at 13. We were very close from then on, and I sat next to him for 3 years at a men's meeting that he started, and I learned many things from him. But I'll tell you what the most beautiful thing I learned from Ray O'Keefe, two things. My father told me when my parents got divorced that God was always with me, and it was the only permanent relationship I was ever going to have. My father had been raised very spiritually. Well, Ray O'Keefe at a men's meeting one night said the exact same thing. He said, God's the only permanent relationship you're ever going to have, so spend some time with him. So I went through the steps. I started sponsoring people. I got the best sobriety in Alcoholics Anonymous. Okay, when I'm 3 or 4 years sober, our group is the best. We are the best. If you don't do it like we do it, you're doing it wrong. You probably don't even know what the steps are in your group. And, it was kind of rough when I'd go to other meetings, it was getting along with people. And I got very arrogant, and I got really full of self. Okay. And this is a really important part of my story. I read page 60 to 63 pretty much every day to this day, because at 4.5 years sober, I got so full of self that by 5.5 years, I didn't want to drink, but I wanted to put a knife through my stomach. And my girlfriend told me I had to call my sponsor before she left. And I called my sponsor, and he brought down my first sponsor at 3:30 in the morning. And he told me to read the third step in the 12 and 12 before he got there. And if you read the third step in the 12 and 12, on the bottom of the first page, it says the effectiveness of the whole program will rest upon turning your will and life over to the care of God as you understand it. And I was going through a period. I went through a 2-week period of delusions. My father had to take me to meetings. It was not good. And that's where self took me. And I ended up having another intense spiritual experience like I had on my 52nd day. I heard Clancy say in a talk that I heard him give that more people kill themselves sober than drunk because they don't have that thing blocking them. And the whole program turned around for me. And we started the Harbor Island group in March of 1987, and I became the first GSR. So not thinking there was any good AA around the New York area, I become the GSR. I start going up to the GSR meeting. There was unbelievable AA everywhere, which is what I found out. There's still meetings that you go to where you leave, you're like, oh my God, I'm gonna hang myself. But that's gonna happen, again, if you're in AA long enough. But beautiful AA. I learned about the traditions. I said, we need to have a traditions meeting in this group. So we started learning about the traditions. We were all between 5 and 6 years sober. And we learned about the traditions. We brought Joe and Charlie in. It was the first time Joe and Charlie ever came to New York State, January of 1988. Or December of 1988, I can't remember. But it revolutionized my understanding of the big book, as most people who go to, Joe and Charlie. And I went down, I had Thanksgiving with Ray O'Keefe that following Thanksgiving. And I am explaining to Ray O'Keefe the big book, okay? There's a guy who's a professor of law, he knows the steps better. And I'm hitting him with everything, stuff I know that I did not hear in the Mamaroneck group, right? And Ray says to me, Max, you can know everything that's in that book, but if you don't have the music, it doesn't mean anything. And it was beautiful, you know? And I got to know Frank M. and who was the archivist at the World Service Office. And he became my spiritual advisor, my service sponsor. And when I moved into New York City, him and I went around and did, in the time I lived in New York City, which was only less than 2 years, we did 2 big book studies around New York City. And Frank taught me so much. He taught me to tell my story. You know, I was telling Frank how much better the AA was in Westchester than New York City, because everyone tells their story in New York City. Doesn't matter what the topic, they're going to tell you their story, you know. And Frank said, Matt, if they don't tell you your story, how do you know a miracle happened? He had just such a way of telling me things. And he taught me the traditions. He told me to go to page 96 of AA Comes of Age. And if you're interested in the traditions, I suggest you do that. And that's where the traditions start, you know. And it's my favorite literature on the traditions. And you get to learn things that if we don't hang together, we die separately, that nobody's in charge, that all groups run differently, and that's okay. And that's where my tolerance, you know, I got my tolerance, you know, and I do a lot of tradition talks. I love the traditions, you know, because I really believe it's why I'm excited at 41 years, you know, because I've stayed in service ever since. You know, Frank taught me that if I don't have enough humility to do coffee at that time, I was like 12 years sober. If I don't have enough humility to do coffee and set up my group, I have no business chairing a meeting. You know, just do humble service, right? When I moved down here to Charleston, I set up chairs for a year at my home group. You know, when I joined the group that I'm a member of now, you know, I showed up early and set up. And it's just what I do. And I did a lot of relationship work. Like Bill, I was very dependent on other people, you know, especially women. Stephen, I have till 8:55. Yay. Okay. Anyone who's on this meeting from New York City might know this guy named Bill Baldwin. Well, I was having a really hard time with relationships, and my sponsor, you know, that he was like, "That's okay. It's who you are. You know, you're gonna go through it." But Bill, I was really struggling with relationships. This girl and I were going back and forth, and Bill Baldwin takes me to the diner, and he looks at me. He says, "I'm kind of telling my woe," and he's like, "Well, it sounds like she's your higher power." I'm like, "But Bill, what are you talking about?" You know? He's like, "Well, your higher power is the thing you think about the most," and it just hit me right in between. You know, I was like, "Whoa." And you know, it gave me enough that I got healthy in that place. And I got healthy enough that I got married. I met my wife when I was 14 years sober, and I got married when I was 15 years sober. And I couldn't have done that if I hadn't gone through the intense codependency stuff that I had gone through, you know? And now this is pre-Atlantic Group, but when Ray O'Keefe had moved to Florida in 1984. When I moved into New York City in 1991, I listened to his tapes that he had done down in Florida. I also finally had read New Pair of Glasses because my sponsor said, Max, this book's going to change your life. He told me that when I was 7 years sober. He's like, you got to read it. So when I was 9 years sober, I read it because that's how I kind of took direction. Right. So, but it did. It changed my life. And when the Atlantic Group started, I went up to Clancy. I said, I need to get those tapes. Like, where are these tapes from your group? So he started sending me tapes for $12 a month, by the way. Check that out, right? It was pretty awesome. And I started hearing all these talks from people in California, you know, the specific group speakers. And I'll tell you what happened to me when I was like 14, 15 years sober. And I hear these people being honest about things that were going on in sobriety. And it was so beautiful. You know, it's like, anybody knows John A. from Texas. He was the first one I ever really heard talk about going through stuff in recovery. And that's what I try to do. I don't resonate with people who skip through every day like roses, you know, everything's roses. You know, I have alcoholism. I'm a complete mess. I work at Home Depot. I could get into a fight every day. Trust me, if I wanted. I mean, the people are just not, you know, they're a little crazy out there. But as Bob Pearson, the last story of our big book, said, we don't go to meetings to survive our drinking. We go to meetings to survive sobriety. You know, so I got married. We have 2 beautiful daughters, and I've been married. I'm coming up on 26 years, and anybody that's married knows that's not an easy feat, sober or not. She knows I'm a lot more spiritual than her. It doesn't help. Yeah, I tell you. I say that kiddingly. She's unbelievable, the stuff that she says to me, you know, and we're a partnership. I practice the traditions in my relationship. My daughters love and respect me. It's unbelievable. My daughter's in Italy, and my wife and I and my older daughter are going to go over on April 1st and spend 10 days with my daughter in Italy, you know? And because I'm recovered from alcoholism, I've worked all 12 steps and I sponsor people and I go to meetings and I'm not worried about going over there and having a drink. Like I heard it in a Mamaroneck meeting many, many years ago. A guy went to Paris and he was with his wife and he's like, I want to be able to do this. And he picked up a glass of wine. I'm not nervous at all, because I have Alcoholics Anonymous. I have Zoom. I'll be on Zoom meetings if I can't find any meetings locally, because I go to meetings when I'm out of town, So I moved down to Charleston about 7.5 years ago, and I knew the AA would be different. And Carolyn, the old timer in the Harbor Island group, she said to me, "Now, Max, you don't go down there and try to save them." She was from Kentucky. She talked, that's kind of how she talked. So you don't go down there and try to change their AA, because she knew me. I did a little changing in our group. But I knew it would be different. I knew they'd read everything at the beginning of the meeting. That's what they do. They don't do that where I'm from. They don't have that chip system. There's a lot of things that are different. And it was getting to me for a while, but this is why I have a sponsor at 41 years. I called my sponsor. This is like right before the pandemic, because I was having a real hard time with the meetings. Like it had kind of gotten to me. I'd been down here about 3.5 years, and I started just really getting the thing about the meetings. And my sponsor's like, "Max, why are you going to the meetings?" I knew the answer. I'm going there because I'm supposed to stay sober and help other alcoholics achieve sobriety, Pete. And he's like, "Yes, that's why you're going to the meetings." And guess what? The AA in Charleston got so much better. I mean, I just went to the meetings to try to help somebody else. Now, I didn't really talk about this much, but I'd gotten Clancy when I was 19 years sober, and I've never not had Pete as my sponsor. But I used to write Clancy every Tuesday, and I talked to him every Wednesday. And I just having that man in my life opened up my whole world of Alcoholics Anonymous. They if you ever hear stories about Clancy, you'll hear about how he'd yell at people and blah blah blah. And he never did that ever, except one time when I was going down to Thanksgiving with my brother, and I called him up and I whined about my brother and my mother. And he said, "Hey, I've been thinking about you, kid. I want you to keep your mouth shut and have a good time. And if I hear that you opened your mouth, I'm not your sponsor anymore." It's like, damn, rough there, Clancy. So my brother comes to Thanksgiving dinner in a dirty t-shirt. It's his house. Apparently that's okay. And I kept my mouth shut. And we had a good time. We didn't get into it. But you hang out with my brother and me today, you'd think we're 10 and 12 years old. And please keep my brother in your prayers. My brother hasn't had a drink for a really long time, but he doesn't go to Alcoholics Anonymous. And his daughter's going through a very hard time. And because of that, he's been going back to meetings. And it's that we go to meetings because we have alcoholism. And that's, he's going and he's loving it. And please keep him and his daughter in your prayers, if you believe in that. So anyway, listen, Stephen, I could talk all night. I mean, I just kind of start getting revved up with this stuff. I mean, I will tell you this, that please, whatever group you're in, wherever you're going, find a big book meeting, find a step meeting, find a traditions meeting, get a speaker meeting, and if you don't have a good speaker meeting in your area, go on Zoom and listen. There's so much good AA around this country. And I'm just grateful to be a part of it. I'm grateful to be here tonight. And thanks for letting me share, Steve.